Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome Dr. Dileni Gunewardena, our keynote speaker today, Dr. Nihal Putiwala, trade economist at World Bank, and of course, all the participants at today's webinar. I am Mr. Hussain, Senior Research Associate, SANEM, that is South Asian Network on Economic Modeling. I will be moderating this session. The topic today is Gender Dimension of Trade, Lessons and Implication for Sri Lanka. The focus of the session will be on the two-way relationship between gender and trade in Sri Lanka, how trade policies have gendered effects, and how gender biases in the economy lead to suboptimal trade policy outcomes. We all know this webinar is part of Bay of Bengal Regional Trade and Connectivity Capacity Building Program, funded by USAID in collaboration with SANEM. Before the lecture starts, let me introduce the keynote speaker with a short bio. Currently, Dr. Dileni is working as the Chair Professor of Economics at the University of Peradeniya, Sri Lanka. She is a non-resident fellow at Verite Research and is a PEP, that is Partnership for Economic Policy Research Fellow. She has an extensive career with experience in empirical research on poverty, child nutrition, and gender and ethnic wage inequality. She has been a Global Development Network Research Award a Fulbright Research University for a program for gender analysis in economics. Also, she has consulted for the United Nations Development Program and the World Bank. She holds a PhD in economics from American University and a BA in economics from the University of Peradeniya. So this is it from my end. Now I request Dr. Dileni to start her dialogue. You can write your comments, questions, and opinions in the comment box. Otherwise, you can wait for the discussion part. Dr. Dileni, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you to SANEM for asking me to present on this topic, which is something that I am passionate about. Excuse me. So without much ado, let me share my screen. Okay. So here's the outline of what I will present today. I'll first talk about gender equality in the current trade policy agenda. I'll then talk about gender structures, gender roles, and gender bias. Then I'll talk a little bit about the gendered nature of the Sri Lankan economy. And then I will talk about the two-way relationship between trade and gender equality. I'll talk about the transmission channels through which trade affects gender. And I'll also talk about how gender inequalities affect export competitiveness and trade performance. Finally, I'll present some of the recommendations made in the literature. And I also have several resources and references. I want to mention at this point that I have a lot of material, and I will be going through this material fairly quickly. I'm very happy to share my slides because I think they'll be a useful resource. So I won't go into everything in great detail for that reason. So if we talk about gender equality in the current trade policy agenda, just a couple of things that I'd like to talk about: the widening scope of trade policy, gender neutrality. Is there such a thing in trade policy? And why does a gender lens matter? So if you think about, why are we talking about gender equality in the first place? Because it is enshrined in international and national instruments. Sri Lanka is a signatory to the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. There is the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action and Beijing +5. Gender equality is an explicit goal among the Sustainable Development Goals, and we have committed to striving towards those goals. It's also part of other goals, for example, the goal to reduce inequality within and among countries. So we have a rights-based reason to value gender equality. But gender equality is also the smart thing to do. And here we have the Canadian Minister for Trade talking about the fact that leaving 50% of the team on the bench means that 50% of the team's strengths and capabilities are left on the bench too. And this is very valid for us when we think about the fact that we have spent, a lot of resources in educating women in this country. And if we are not using all those resources, it is indeed a waste of our investment. So when governments fail to see trade through a gendered lens, they fail to see that trade has not benefited women and men equally. And this is actually the important point that is being made here, that failing to see trade through a gendered lens leads to problems, and I'll talk about those in detail in a little bit. Neglecting to look squarely at the numbers and ask whether trade is gender neutral effectively resigns women to the bench. The costs of doing so are stark. In Canada alone, removing the barriers to more women engaging in international trade would boost the economy by $150 billion. So we can see that there is a strong economic reason to promote gender equality, to remove the barriers that prevent women from engaging more in trade. Also, as we saw, during the past few years, and as we are seeing now, crises tend to affect women more. Women tend to be employed in service sectors that are more vulnerable to disruption, to trade disruption. And this is from a 2020 report from the World Bank and the WTO. So, for example, with order cancellations and closing of retail shops in the West, you had factory shutdowns in our part of the world. Right? Tourism and hospitality also engage women, and they're in large numbers, or largish numbers, and that too was affected by COVID. So these risk indicators are related to sectors affected either by shutdown or by distance, by travel restrictions or by distancing measures. So talking about trade policy measures, I'm not going to go through each of these, but for those of you who are here because you have an interest in gender, but perhaps you're not that familiar with trade policy, this is simply to refresh your mind on the kinds of policies that are there. And for those of you who are here because your background is in trade, but you are would like to know more about gender, this is simply setting out the fact that there are many policy instruments through which trade has an impact on gender, or gender has an impact on trade. And here are several constraints that affect women in gender. At the border, these are simply a few of the ones we saw before: tariffs, non-tariff measures, and discrimination, harassment. Beyond the border, things like access to education, finance, and digital technologies, basically things that make it basically that women are not facing a level playing field when they come into engaging in trade. There's legal discrimination, not necessarily only in trade-related policies, but legal discrimination elsewhere that affects how they engage in trade. And then there are social, cultural, and behavioral constraints that, again, prevent them from engaging in trade. So the assumption that economic policies are gender neutral has been increasingly challenged, and it has also become clear that economic policy, including trade policy, can play a critical role in narrowing the gender gap only if policymakers consciously take into account these horizontal differences. And the UN Interagency Task Force on Financing for Development has said that there's a review of trade policies of 111 WTO members from 2014 to 2018, which shows that about 70% of members have integrated women's empowerment in their national or regional trade strategy in order to enhance women's workforce participation. Some strategies aim at promoting female employment and access to male-dominated economic sectors. So these are to be lauded. And then in 2017, I think 118 member countries signed a declaration on joint declaration on trade and women's economic empowerment. And some key features of this were participation in trade as entrepreneurs, traders, or workers. Countries are encouraged to share an inventory of information resources. There is the Aid for Trade initiative to promote women's greater inclusion, but this agreement or this declaration is non-binding. So it is simply an expression of countries' willingness or interest. There's nothing to hold countries to actually do what they say they want to do. So when we talk about gendered structures, gender roles, and gender bias, I'm going to talk here about some things that are somewhat basic, but then move on to other things. But I found that understanding this key concept is important to understanding what we mean when we talk about a gender lens. In other words, that we are not just talking about, disaggregating data by male and female and then looking at what happens or what the outcomes are or what the relationships are, but understanding that these roles, activities, needs, responsibilities, and characteristics are socially framed or socially, influenced. And this is a slide that I often present to my students. Like I said, it's basic, but understanding the difference is key. So on the right-hand side, we have some things that many people, without thinking, just attribute it to, the difference between men and women, not realizing that it is something that is a result of nurture rather than nature. So we can ask the question, does this have to be? And so basically, the first thing in understanding a gender lens is to see that gender is a social construct, and these biological differences are interpreted by society to create a set of social expectations that define appropriate behaviors And they also determine access to rights, resources, and power in society. And it is this that leads to unequal treatment or perception of individuals based on their gender. So when we talk about economies are also gendered. So when we look at this, expression of the sort of circular flow, we have here the business sector, we have the household sector. We've also included here the public sector and non-profit institutions. And we are usually familiar with thinking that the household sector provides labor to the business and public sectors, receives goods and services and monetary flows from these sectors. But actually, the household, some of it is paid if we hire people to work for us within the household. Much of it is unpaid. Some of it is subsistence work. Some of it is care work. So basically, we can also see that much of the work that takes place within households tends to be done by women. And much of the work that takes place in the business sector tends to be done by men. And within these sectors, we also see gender differences, and we'll look at that in a little while. Now, this is from an UNCTAD training manual, and I really like it. It separates women's economic roles into workers and producers, traders, consumers, and taxpayers. And importantly, when we look at consumers, it's not just what they do in terms of private consumption, but they are also the users of public services. And very often they are more likely to use public services, or public services are more likely to matter to them than they do to men. And we'll talk about that in a bit. They're also taxpayers. And they're taxpayers not just in terms of taxes on income, but they have a higher exposure to indirect taxes on consumption as well. When we look at women as workers and producers, we know there's labor segregation at industrial, sectoral, and occupational level. And that's, horizontal segregation. But there's also vertical segregation, that women tend to be clustered at the bottom and middle of the, job ladder and face glass ceilings. They also face a gender wage gap. We'll talk about that a little bit more. They are often concentrated in precarious and low-paid forms of work. In many countries, they have fewer skills and lower education. They have restricted time availability because they are also doing this unpaid work in the household. And they have limited access to and control over income and productive resources, for example, credit, land, and inputs. And as traders, they have issues with travel, with transportation, with bargaining power. They face gender-based violence and harassment. Again, they have limited access to capital. They have higher health-related risks. They have limited access to formal social protection measures and business development services that tend to be designed to take into the consideration, or they're focused on male entrepreneurs rather than female entrepreneurs. And then as consumers, they have a higher exposure to increases in import prices, especially when we're talking about food, and they have a higher vulnerability to cuts in public expenditure. So we now focus on what happens when there is trade, and what's the kind of gender bias or gender breakdown of this. And we see actually that a low percentage of firms is female-owned and global. But among this, we also see that exporting firms tend to have more females. And also we see among services, more women and also more women in firms that are related to exports, imports, and GVC participants. Now, finally, talking of an important concept that we will think about a little bit more as we move along, and that is gendered competitive advantage. So this is not to be confused with comparative advantage, but this is thinking in terms of competitive advantage, which are factors that enable a country to produce better or more cheaply than its rivals. And women are often sources of competitive advantage because they may be providing unpaid labor, or they may be low-paid wage workers contributing to the business of others. And they are underachievers of competitive advantage. In other words, competitive advantage doesn't necessarily accrue to them because as owners of own businesses who need access to land, technology, and networks to compete with male businesses, they are disadvantaged when it comes to taking advantage of this competitive advantage. So let's move to the gendered nature of the Sri Lankan economy. And so 52% of the population are women, but only 30% of the labor force are women. 34% of the employed are women. In the estate sector, this goes up to 41%. 41% of the private sector are women, and 23% of the public sector are women. Keep in mind that when we say private sector here, we mean both formal and informal. 40% of the formal sector are women, 30% of the informal sector are women. 22% of employees are women, and 13% of employees, 22% and 13% of employers. 27% of own account workers, and 80% of unpaid family workers are women. When we look at unemployment and inactivity, the female unemployment rate is 6%, but that's twice the male unemployment rate. 56% of the unemployed are women, 70% of the inactive are women, and 50% of inactive women said they're inactive because they are household workers. When we look at the gender wage gap, 22% is the overall wage gap. So women earn 78% of what men earn overall. Among formal employees, this is 87%. Among informal employees, this is 65%. And among the self-employed, this is 77%. So these are from the World Bank Skills Towards Employment and Productivity survey, which was done in 2012 for Sri Lanka. Now, looking at time use data, and this is from the DCS time use final report, participation in unpaid and care work is 60% for men. So only 60% of men do any kind of unpaid or care work, whereas 87% of women, and when we say women, we're talking about women and girls and men and boys. Okay? And when we look at the time spent among, by that 60% of men and 87% of women, the men spend 2.5 hours on average, and the women spend almost 6.5 hours on average. When we look at structural changes in the economy, and we are looking here from 1992 to 2018, we can see that agriculture's contribution to GDP and employment fell quite steeply. Men moved out of agriculture into industry and services. As you can see, the men, as agriculture falls, industry has risen and services have also risen. But for women, while both have risen, industry has not risen by very much. Services, on the other hand, have risen by quite a bit. The rise, the slight rise that you can see there is coming from export manufacturing. Now, this is from an UNTAD report done by Elisa Brownstein and a colleague. And what we see here is that, so this is, I'm not sure whether you can read this, but as I said, I will share my slides. This is the share of women's employment in 1992, and this is the share of women's employment in 2018. So basically, as this, the bottom area increases, a sector's share has increased. And as it decreases, that sector's share has decreased. And we can see, for example, that agriculture's share has decreased, right? And manufacturing has increased. On the vertical axis is relative labor productivity. So the real output divided by employment of these sectors relative to overall productivity in the economy. And what we see is that although women moved out of agriculture and into services and trade and manufacturing, when we take all the sectors in which they average productivity, that was 50.7% in 1992, but it's become, it's become 56.9, 87.4% in 2018. So basically, despite this increase into what we think would be better, more productive jobs, we see that actually the share of low productive sectors or less than average productive sectors has declined for women, whereas for men, that was not the case. For men, it moved from 56.9% in 1992. Okay, sorry. For men, also it declined. We found more low productive sectors, but not as much as the decline for women. Okay. And most of this change is related to women moving into manufacturing and trade services as the relative labor productivity of these sectors decline. And we'll talk a little bit later about why this relative labor productivity decline. So now let's talk about the two-way relationship between trade and gender equality. And we'll first talk about how gender inequalities affect export competitiveness and trade policy. So I'm very grateful to Marzia Fontana, who gave me permission to use her slides. These slides. Here we have gender biases in the economy. And if we follow the blue line, we see that that's then, despite trade policies, it creates bottlenecks between trade policies and trade performance. So trade policies which might assume that trade is gender neutral are implemented. Gender biases prevent these policies from achieving the desired policy goals. And on the other side, we have trade policies that interact with existing biases in the economy and either reinforce them or reduce them. And we'll look at the blue movement first. So gender inequalities undermine export performance, and there are two examples here. I've also adapted this from Fontana. The first one is looking at agriculture-based economies. And in agriculture-based economies, if you have unequal household power relations, depending on the bargaining power of husbands, who tend to be the people who will adopt cash crops, they may or may not be able to get their wives to supply labor to them. And this is most relevant in African countries. Darity modeled this on African countries. And as a result, it can mute the supply response. And why would wives not supply their labor? Because they are also engaged in unpaid work and in domestic production and perhaps subsistence production. Here's a paper by Blecker and Seguino, which is looking at the cost and flexibility of production. And this is in the context of export industries, where women are more likely to be engaged in the export industry, and they're producing for export, but in somebody else's firm and receiving wages. And here you have men producing for the domestic market. And what Blecker and Seguino find is that the results of this really depend on a variety of factors. It depends on the flexibility of wages. If wages are increased and they're not flexible, then you will find exports decreasing. But it's only if you have flexible wages and a crawling peg that you will find export expansion when women's wages increase. So sometimes gender equality can actually lead to negative trade outcomes. Looking at Sri Lanka, care and unpaid work constraints and norms can limit female labor force participation expansion. Married women are much less likely to be paid than boys and unmarried women. So this work by Stafford, myself, by Solotaroff and others, which shows that married women tend to go into self-employment because it helps them to manage their dual roles. So trade policies that are relying on female labor may not work unless the constraints that married women face are addressed. And the constraints that married women face are norms and care. There's gender-based violence. There's sexual harassment when commuting, which Solotaroff has reported in her work. And then there's low wages. So again, all of these authors have shown that the gender wage gap is mostly unexplained. So in other words, the gender wage gap in Sri Lanka is not due to lower human capital, because women have more human capital. It's not necessarily due to more experience or cognitive skills, or even perhaps non-cognitive skills. So there is an issue there. And because of these low wages, women are, there is a substitution effect. In other words, women are less likely to join the labor force. But Lopez, Acevedo, and Robertson have shown that a 1% increase in the expected wage can increase women's likelihood to join the labor force by 89%. So that's a very strong elasticity to the wage. And so increasing wages can reduce this constraint and can increase female labor supply. So in economics terms, actually, this first point is talking about perhaps the income effects also, because married women are more likely to have another income, as well as, household preferences. And then, and this would contribute to household preferences, because you wouldn't like your spouse going to work when there is a danger of, sexual harassment in community. So all of these will add a cost, both pecuniary and non-pecuniary. Whereas here, wages would be the benefit that would be received from working. So talking more about the female labor supply response, women's participation in high-tech sectors like ICT are constrained by social norms of appropriate educational fields for boys and girls. And the kind of study and training courses that are available for women are very narrow. So again, we see that norms play a role in women getting involved in higher productive sectors. So to increase women's economic empowerment, the foremost thing should be to ease the main barriers, which include traditional social norms, women's disproportionate responsibility for unpaid care work, as well as the lack of employment opportunities in higher productive sectors. So I know we're talking about trade here, but when we think about trade in services, right, migration is important. About 40% of departures in recent years have been of women, who are mainly low-skilled domestic workers. And altogether, men and women equal about 12% of the working age population. And as you can see, this motivated the family background report, which was removed in June of this year, which in terms of women going overseas and having the freedom to work where they would like to, is a good thing. Now we talk about the other channel, which is the impact of trade on gender inequality. And here there are three main channels, again, the employment effects, consumption effects, public provision effects. And men and women have multiple roles as producers, as workers, as carers, as taxpayers and users of public services. So we also need to consider heterogeneity when we are looking at this, because the effects will work by economic structure. There's a diversity of women's constraints and needs. There are small producers, there's factory workers, there's women with care responsibilities, and there are possible trade-offs. In other words, there's greater availability of jobs, but a possible deterioration in working conditions and an increase in total work burdens. So here's looking at, again, this figure is thanks to Fontana. So we look here at what trade policy can do. It can either reduce or reduce gender inequalities. And that can happen either through the employment channel or through the consumption and public provision channel. So to have a positive effect, the employment channel would need to create decent jobs in sectors previously closed to women. And the consumption channel would improve the availability of affordable food and household goods, for which women tend to take the responsibility. But negative results would be if it increases female force participation, but maintains the gender wage gap and segregation, or undermines delivery of social services of value for vulnerable women. Let's talk a little bit more about that. So looking at the positive results, sort of a general analysis shows that trade increases in the share of GDP, the gender inequality index falls, right? Current tariff structures benefit male households in 78% of the countries assessed, and Sri Lanka is one of them. They are over here, right? The average female labor share is higher from manufacturing firms integrated into global trade. So we see that, and we also see that the more you are, in the global value chain, the more likely that there is a greater share of women engaged in that sector. We'll talk about that. Non-PVC participants are less. Foreign direct investment firms are more compared to domestically owned firms. Women are less likely to be in informal jobs if they work in trade integrated sectors. And we can see the higher point is for women and the lower point is for men. So we see that actually women benefit from both exports and GVC participation, not only in labor force share, but also in terms of the formality of the job. And GVC firms employ more women than non-GVC firms, which we've already seen. But there are issues with this. That was the sort of positive side of the picture. But they tend to lose jobs as industries upgrade, right? And the employment gains of women in some countries are at the expense of women in others. Female unskilled international migrants face special hardship, and limited access to credit, technology, and marketing channels constrains women in export agriculture. And even when a crop is traditionally female, very often commercializing it causes men to take over. So here are some insights from the evidence on trade and gender wage gaps. So this actually, the evidence tends to be mixed, right? So Fontana argues that they capture only female workers with formal contracts. Gender wage gaps remain large in many countries. I'll talk in a little bit about Sri Lanka. And these studies have shown widening gender wage gaps in countries that initially may have had narrowing wage gaps or that employed more women. And women's low education compared to men's, it's not a plausible explanation because we find this in countries where women's education is actually equal or higher. Job training may be a significant factor. And here's a paper done by Jivika Viraheba in 2002, where she modeled three factors, male, female, and capital. And she found that the wage gap is narrower when trade policies expand the garment sector. But factor specificity matters. And the biggest impact was when female labor is treated as a specific factor, and the smallest impact is when capital is treated as the specific factor. So basically, the idea is with technological advancement and greater capital intensity, that wages are likely to not to increase for female labor. So in the short run, there's a bigger impact, which narrows in the long run. And this was in 2002, with data that was prior to that. But Robertson and others in 2020 looked at Sri Lanka and Cambodia. And for Sri Lanka, what they found was that there were wage premiums and a narrowing gap during the multi-fiber agreement, but they widened after the multi-fiber agreement. Okay, trade and gender can also have effects on intra-household resource allocation. So it can create or destroy sources of independent income for women, and hence their influence over household decisions. It can change the prices of goods, and if this is food, then that's detrimental to women usually. And then family members of different ages and genders rely on social services to different degrees. And care is particularly one that affects women. Trade can also affect the gender division of non-market care work. For example, girls may have to take on their mother's responsibility. And here's some evidence. Export-oriented agriculture increases women's workloads, but not their control over income. Contract farming affects the time use of older daughters. Women are likely to have greater control over income if they work in factories than if they are home-based. And an increasing number of factory workers who are married with children in Central America and Laos talked about having different aspirations for their daughters. So I'll go through this very quickly. Here are 6 basic questions to ask when one is trying to do a gender and trade impact assessment. One is a structure of male and female employment. So where are men and women located in the economy? What's the difference between the female employment patterns and male employment patterns in terms of sectors with potential for export expansion? And what about those that will be exposed to import competition? Right? So on this side, these are the questions to ask. These are the issues that can arise. And here we have working conditions. So very often we're very happy when female labor force participation increases or female labor supply increases. But what about working conditions? So not just how many jobs are likely to be created or destroyed, but whether they respect labor standards. Many countries focus their export strategy on labor-intensive goods produced by cheap female labor. Remember, we talked about competitive advantage. So it might stimulate profits in the short run, but it would be counterproductive in the long run. So if there's greater gender equality in access to skills, capital, and infrastructure, then you have higher returns on investment and sustainable growth. Then the role of unpaid work, because this is both something that affects women's well-being, but it's also a barrier to women seizing new opportunities related to trade. Then access to control over resources. especially for agriculture as well as for entrepreneurship. Then trade and consumption. Who's in charge of food expenditure? How's family consumption distributed gender-wise? And how does trade affect food prices and household items? And then finally, trade revenue and public services. So what is the proportion of social sector spending that supports gender equality? So this needs to be known for trade, for assessing trade policy effects on gender. How is the promotion of gender equality objectives affected by changes in the regulation of public services? So again, this depends on what exists, what's being offered, and what's being cut. So finally, let's move to a few recommendations. So one recommendation from this UNCTAD report, which actually is looking specifically at a few countries, and Sri Lanka is one of them, and that's to look for regional trading blocs. The idea being that the market is less saturated, so competition and loss of jobs is less of a risk. And it could ease the transition into high value added production. Green jobs are another possibility, things that have potential, but very often as green jobs become more formalized and automated, then they are likely to be dominated by men. So the challenge is less about skill building than addressing the gender norms and stereotypes that segregate women and men into different activities or industries and keep them from seeing themselves as leaders, innovators, or entrepreneurs. And social infrastructure, and especially care investments. So care provisioning is essential for well-being as well as for the production and maintenance of the labor force and productivity growth. So this is something that, when people do macroeconomics and we talk about the labor force, or we talk about labor as a factor, we don't think about where that labor comes from. And if you think, we think of it as the population, but the population is born and then the population is nurtured and the population gets human capital. And if you think about the steps along the way, within households as well as in schools, a lot of the inputs into that productivity growth are from women. And I think that needs to be highlighted. That needs to be understood, that really the unpaid work, the invisible work that is done in households is the fabric that makes it possible to have a labor force. If you've had to do some of that work yourself, you know what I'm talking about. So that's from the point of view of viewing care, from a economic perspective, getting it conceptually right, but also it's also something that is useful from a point of view of cost-benefit analysis, in the sense that studies have shown, studies that have used CGE models in Turkey and in 7 OECD countries, have shown that expanding care infrastructure has more potential for employment creation than a construction boom. In fact, this study by Dileni and Himmelweit has shown that it's actually care creates double the employment than construction. The spending on social infrastructure is classified as government consumption. and not public investment, which severely limits the scope of social infrastructure financing. So if we think of it in terms of the way I was describing it earlier, care provision, social infrastructure is an investment. So that's basically an issue. Then let me quickly talk about non-tariff barriers. Discriminatory and non-transparent non-tariff measures hurt women traders, especially when they raise compliance costs associated with procedures, regulations, and standards, which can be particularly burdensome for small enterprises with little experience in trade. So eliminating also gender-related tariff differences is something that needs to, tariff differentials is something that needs to be done. A lack of competition in services decreases the productivity of services firms and increases operating costs of all firms in the economy. So, loosening regulation in services is something that could improve service productivity. Enhancing cross-border trade to trade facilitation, trade finance, gender-friendly trade-related technical assistance, and women empowering trade-related capacity building is something that has also been recommended in the literature. Gender equity, gender analysis, and gender indicators. So basically having a gender audit to assess benefit gains, costs, and losses from trade is something that has been promoted or has been mooted. And gender-sensitive aid for trade, which we know there is the Aid for Trade initiative, but according to Fontana, there's only something like 2% that is allocated for for aid to women entrepreneurs. So there are still deficiencies in what's out there. And then these are also, I think, from Mariana Williams. And this is each country develops a framework for engendering its trade-related capacity building and aid for trade programs. Ensure that trade diagnostic studies focus on promoting trade readiness, and market entry includes gender analysis and pay attention to the specific needs of women-owned SMEs, as well as other sectors in the economy that are likely to be adversely impacted. Proactively include gender-sensitive frameworks for each of the sectoral areas under negotiation. Gender-sensitive flanking measures to deal with the negative outcomes of trade and reform underlying the implementation of trade agreements. So I'll conclude here. And there are several resources and references that have been provided.
Thank you, Dr. Dileni, for your intuitive and informative lecture. We have researchers, academicians, government official participants with us today. I thank you all for joining the webinar. Before going to the discussion session, I welcome renowned trade economist Dr. Mia Mirkit and Dr. Nihal Putigala, and also Dr. Selim Raihan, Executive Director, SANEM. Now, I request everyone to participate discussion through writing your opinion and question in the comment box. Thank you. Dr. Dileni, some questions are already there in the comment box. If you want, I can read them for you, or you can read them and answer.
Shall I read them?
Which one you prefer?
Okay, yes. So the first question is about
Hi, Dileni, this is Salim. After a long time, we are meeting. If I can request Tisha, Ishrat, if you can read it out for Professor Dileni can respond to this question.
Sure, sir.
Yeah.
Sure. Participants. Uh, a participant, Kisuri Rosie Eka Nayak. I'm sorry for my pronunciation.
No problem. That was very good. Thank you.
Okay, so the first question is one, Sri Lanka is currently in a macro situation where foreign exchange earnings have become very intense. As mentioned, trying to improve gender equality might lead to worse trade outcomes, at least in the short term. In such a context, would policymakers be insensitivized to create gender sensitive? We can frame this issue so that they do. So I think, Dr. Dileni, over to you.
Sure. So let me respond to that question, those two questions. First of all, good question. I think what you have to think about is both the cost and the benefit. So I think we often think, we cannot afford to do this. So if you think about the kinds of things we want to do to increase foreign earnings, many of them are dependent on the female labor force. And if the female labor force, given that the current the crisis is impacting on women in terms of their consumption as well. So it means that they are doing things that, let me just give a simple example. Maybe you're no longer using gas, you're using firewood. And if you're in a rural area, you're actually, collecting your own firewood. That may be sort of an extreme example, but there are many things. Basically, the time burden of women has probably increased because of the crisis. So if you are not going to provide the kind of social support that is needed, either in terms of, social protection, in terms of cash transfers, and so on, or you're not going to provide the social infrastructure that is needed, you are going to end up with this inflexible supply response, labor supply response. There has been a decline, but certainly employment decreased during the pandemic from the information that we have.
So we can go for the second question from the same person. Question number 2 is, in terms of improving women's bargaining power in the workplace, is unionization useful?
Yes, absolutely. It's useful, and there's sort of no reason not to have it, except if you want to use low wages to give you more competitive advantage. But certainly from a government's point of view, from the point of view of improving women's bargaining power, unionization is important.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Dileni. So we can go for the next person's question. The participant name is Chaya Dishanaike. So he said, thank you for the interesting presentation. What kind of changes had the pandemic and the post-pandemic economic turbulence had brought about in female employment in Sri Lanka?
Thank you. I actually answered that question thinking it was Tisuri's second question. So yes, the pandemic, we can also speculate. We have information that employment did decline. We can also speculate in terms of women's workload because, if you remember, schools were closed. So that meant that women were at home or women had to deal with children at home, whether or not they were working. Many women might have had to make other arrangements. Many women might have had to leave their jobs if their jobs were inflexible about what they could do. You also had teachers who were dealing with having children at home and teaching at the same time. So certainly the pandemic, this has been documented in many other countries, and there's some work done in Sri Lanka as well, that the pandemic did have disproportionate effect on women.
Mikit, she actually wrote in the comment box and had some questions. So I'm reading it out for you. Excellent tour. Dr. Mia Mikit, I think you can also speak the question for Dr. Dileni.
Thank you very much. I think Professor Dileni, excellent presentation. I enjoyed it very much, and I'm very sorry that I came in a little bit late because of connectivity issues. But I tried to follow it nevertheless, and I really enjoyed such a rich cover of literature. But as we know, most of the papers are published with a lag of about 1 year or even more. So I guess most of the journal articles were written pre-pandemic and pre-experience of very fast digitalization and automation and the pressure of changes in terms of global value chains, where technology will be playing a role, because you mentioned very correctly that wages were a very important factor of competitiveness, but that was while the factories and the firms were allowed to pursue efficiency as the only goal. Now they are limited in terms of national security and various sanctions and bans in terms of choosing where to produce, with whom to trade, etc., which will limit this sort of chase for the cost minimization, right? So I'm just wondering if you can make some comments in terms of the impact of automation and digitalization on this demand and supply of male and female, keeping in mind that female labor is also not homogeneous, and we can't treat it as one category anymore. Maybe it was at a time when we only had textile and apparel production and stuff like that, but not anymore with knowledge services, etc. And then just one comment, if I may. I apologize to the organizer for speaking that long, but I really enjoyed your presentation. Two things, that that can be very nicely brought together, which is unionization and regional trading blocks. And the questions were asked about both, or you mentioned the impact of regional trade agreements. And basically, the modern deep agreements have chapters on labor standards and impose these sort of provisions that request freedom of unionization. One of the additional reasons why regional trade agreements may work in favor of women is also due to this higher sort of emphasis on labor standards protection.
Demand in terms of digitalization. So I'm, as you know, as we know, in many countries, automation has affected the demand for female labor. To the best of my knowledge, there was some work done, I believe, by IPS. And if I remember right, it showed that it wasn't affecting Sri Lanka yet. But of course it might in the future. So that's from the point of view of eliminating digitalization and sort of ICT jobs and moving into higher technology. The constraint seems to be that women are not staying in those jobs. And one of the reasons when we look at female labor force participation, one of the big things seems to be that women with secondary education move out of the labor force. And what seems to be driving them is definitely marriage. We don't have a lot of data on gender roles or norms, but some research that I was involved in, which we haven't published yet, but there was a World Bank ILO survey that was done, which used, gender role attitudes. And certainly gender role attitudes seem to play a strong role in the movement of these people away from the labor force. But when we're talking about sort of ICT skills, we are also talking about tertiary education. And generally speaking, tertiary education tends to pull women into the labor force. This is anecdotal evidence that I have from speaking to human resource managers in ICT firms, especially where they are part of an international firm, and the mother company requires that they have certain quotas, and they are unable to meet those quotas, not because there aren't women in the universities or there aren't women computer science graduates, but because these women don't want to work in computer science anymore. And so, then we have to look at not just sort of general social norms, but we also have to look at workplace norms and, workplace environment and so on. So that's where we're getting into what somebody once called first world problems. Your point is well taken about labor being far from homogeneous, and I think this has addressed some of it from the point of view of skills. From the point of view of education, I've also spoken a little bit to that. I think from the point of view of culture, also, we do have, different cultures with different degrees of acceptability of women working outside the home. But by and large, the sort of general cultural notion is that women should get a good job in the public sector. And that's really the best place for women to be. And there's work that I did which showed actually that at least in terms of, the raw gender wage gap, this was, and I think even in terms of the conditional gender wage gap, that it was a rational decision. In other words, you were discriminated less in the public sector because, you have structures and so on. The public sector is, most of the formal sector in Sri Lanka. So that's why women would want to join the public sector. So they have good working conditions and good pay relative to men. So, and your point about labor standards protection is well taken as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mia Mikic and Dr. Dileni for wonderful discussion. Now I'm reading out another question for you, Dr. Dileni. So Manisha Gunewardena, she actually commented that, wonderful presentation, Professor. Good to listen to you after a long time. Related to unionization, given how the current export zones are structured within a new liberalist structure and how women who are engaged in the export sector being the ones mostly marginalized, how effective would it be the option of having unions? Any evidence you can think of where this has been practiced?
Thank you, Manisha. Good question, hard question. So when I say unions would help, I'm thinking of a sort of a radical change. In a sense, I'm thinking of the export processing zones. Okay, they could be, geographically marginalized, but they don't have to be, in terms of regulations, they don't have to remain an enclave. I don't see any reason why regulations cannot be changed. And I cannot recall, places where this has been done, but I know that there are strong unions, women's unions, or unions of, occupations where women are strongly represented. So it's not something I think impossible. My feeling is that probably in Latin America, but I can't think of something to cite that this is possible. But it would require commitment away from protecting employers. Not having unions at the beginning made sense because you wanted to draw in employers. And of course, there is the danger that if you remove unions, then you might lose employers. But on the other hand, if employers have invested, if employers find that, Sri Lankan labor is something they like to work with, and they have, they've already got their networks and so on, I'm thinking that the cost at this point is less than would have been at the beginning. So I am being optimistic there.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Dileni. I request all the participants, if you want to ask any question, then you can unmute your microphone and you can talk directly to Dr. Dileni.
Thank you. Mia has shared a resource, which I'm guessing has to do with unions.
Yes.
No, it's not with the unions, but it is actually, as you may know, OECD has come up with framework for analysis of women and trade, and so the first review that was done on New Zealand just earlier this year, and I find that report very insightful because it looks at these three buckets of functions of women as producers, as consumers, as entrepreneurs, etc., taxpayers, and that you mentioned in your recommendations as well, and it goes through all the regional agreements that New Zealand has signed and different other domestic policies. So it's a comprehensive report, which I think is helpful for those that studied the topic, and it has a big section on labor standards. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Dileni, I think we can wait for a few minutes for any question further.
I guess we have no more questions.
Yeah, I guess so. So I request Dr. Nihal Pitigala for having some closing remarks for this session.
Thank you, Dileni. That was, I have never sat on a presentation where I couldn't take my eyes and ears off a presentation, and this is one of them. Needless to say how consequential and important this topic is, that we have had two resources actually present over the last 11 months under the BIMSTEC program. So I thank you for a very deep and thoughtful presentation. What I think would like to do is one quick remark. I'm particularly intrigued by the prospects of trade reform having on gender employment, basically given that the agriculture sector still dominate. And now the prognosis is given that the World Bank has done a study that para-tariff liberalization itself will bring about the 10% change in employment, positive change, and full liberalization would be to increase up to 14%. Now, taking that, and as Mia tried to highlight, the scenario somewhat has changed globally, and this new tendencies for the slowdown in most advanced economies and the reliance of trade as per se. So these two counteracting forces, liberalization on one hand and the global slowdown, how that generally might impact, on Sri Lanka, especially the gender engagement and especially gender-specific sector, especially wearing apparel and the others. So that's an intriguing sort of thing to sort of look at as we move forward for the future. If you have any quick thoughts on that, that would be very useful. But other than that, I think we should sort of distribute this recording widely, both among women and men, I would propose, and perhaps solicit feedback, if you don't mind, and relay back to you at some stage. I will end with that, my short.
Thank you. Yes, I don't really have anything to add to what you said on the World Bank and so on. And I'd be delighted for the slides to be shared. Yeah, for the recording to be shared. Yeah.
Okay, Sarat, we can close the proceeding. Thank
you.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone, for participating. I think we can end this program for today. Thank you, Dr. Dileni. We will have a broader outlook with trade and gender, I think, from now on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.